Hello, good morning. My name is Kevin Anderson, and I'm running for County Commissioner. And today I have a very special guest, Representative Kristin Bahner, who is representing Maple Grove and Osseo in 34B. Thanks for joining me, Kristin.
Hello, everybody.
So,
Good morning.
good morning. So the reason, in case anybody's actually wondering, we are recording this the night before. So we are saying good morning, even though the sun is shining, and yeah, the joys of recorded video in a time of pandemic. so so the reason that I wanted to talk to you, Representative, is because you're the chair of the subcommittee on elections. And I mean, there's a whole lot happening with elections this year, and I just kind of wanted to get an idea. So what does that subcommittee do?
Well, so thank you. First of all, you gave me a promotion. I'm actually the vice chair
Yes.
of the subcommittee on elections. Chair Ray Dean is actually the head of that committee. But thank you for that. I appreciate the step up, right?
It
But
was a vote of confidence.
yeah, I appreciate that. Now, what we do basically in our committee is essentially we look at all issues related to state and local elections for Minnesota. So anything that has to do with voting on the state level, we would take a look at that, as well as sometimes potential local things, like, for example, we might review something around ranked choice voting. Which many cities have been opting into around the state more recently, particularly in those races where there's a lot of different candidates for things like state school board or those types of races.
Very good. Now, I'm kind of one of those people. I like to follow the news of the day. And I understand that a bill was recently passed relating to elections and election security. What does that do? How does it help our elections?
Right. Well, there were originally two bills, or there was one bill that was actually split into two, I should say. The part that actually passed the House recently is a bipartisan bill that was hard fought with both Republican and Democratic representatives who really looked through the language and made sure that it was something that they could both live with. But it has a couple provisions that are really important that people should know about. The first and foremost on the top of the list is that it actually allows us to leverage round 3 of the HAVA funds. Those are the Help America Vote Again, or Help America Vote Act funds. Sorry.
That's all right.
Those funds basically allow us to use that for things like cybersecurity. In the case of this round 3, it also allows us to use that money for things like providing protective safety equipment and sanitation at polling places, maybe additional training. It could also allow us to take care of staff costs for things like processing mail ballots before and after the election, which of course, with our new reality of COVID-19 is really, really important to be able to do those kinds of things. It is round 3 of the funding, and as some of you may remember, rounds 1 and 2 were about the fact that in 2016, Minnesota was one of these states that was actually targeted by hackers, and they tried to get in, and as the Secretary of State likes to put it, it's sort of like they kind of broke into the parking lot and they kind of cruised around and cased the joint, but they didn't actually break in, which is of course great for us, and it means that the integrity of our voter data is still secure. But because of that, they gave us some additional funds to fortify our cybersecurity and our voting rules and make sure that those things are locked down, that voter data is safe for the future.
Yeah. And you mentioned something I think that's kind of important, especially in our current reality. You know, there's a lot of talk of vote by mail. Minnesota has kind of a strong history of absentee voting and making sure that people have legitimate access to the ballot,
Yeah.
regardless of their circumstance. Do you know how many people have traditionally used the absentee or vote by mail option that Minnesota currently has?
Yes, I can certainly cover that. And I should, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to back up for 1 second because on that bill, we mentioned the HAVA portion, but we didn't actually mention what else that bill did. So if you don't mind, I'll back up for 1 second just to tell you about what the other things are in that bill. And then we can go back to vote by mail just to make sure that we keep it concise, if
Yeah,
that's all right.
absolutely.
The other thing that that bill does actually is there's a couple other provisions that I think are really important for people to know about. And they are going to make a big difference in terms of our elections for this fall, for both the primary and for the general election. In addition to those HAVA funds that allow us to have greater cyber security and take care of our polling places and our poll workers, the other pieces of that are that it makes some different provisions in there, particularly things like third-party folks who want to get onto the ballot. Traditionally, you have to fill out a form, you have to collect signatures in person, and then be able to submit those in order to get on a ballot. Now, because of our new reality, we are allowing those third-party candidates who still want to get on the ballot to collect signatures electronically and submit them to the Secretary of State. So that is a change that we're allowing to be done a little bit differently. Another piece around that is there's also something around updating the dates that by which we have to solidify our polling locations. The reason that one is important is that right now, a lot of our polling locations are in places like senior high rises, which under normal circumstances is fantastic, right? Because seniors don't have to travel very far. They literally just have to go down to the lobby or something like that to be able to vote. But obviously, because they are now a high-risk population and have more underlying conditions where we want to make sure that they're safe and protected, we want to have the flexibility to move the polling places in those locations to somewhere else that might be a little bit safer. So there is flexibility to do that. Another really important thing that it does is for our Republican friends, there are some conflicts with their Republican National Convention. And they have certain things that need to be submitted by specific dates, which unfortunately fall literally in the middle of the convention. So it's pretty hard to be able to provide data that hasn't been solidified yet. So it does fix that problem for our Republican friends. And then the last thing that it does that I think is really important to point out, especially as we start to talk about vote by mail, is that it allows 14 days for processing ballots before the election. Now, they can't actually release any data, obviously, but they can start processing those ballots.
Yep.
And it also allows for 2 days after the election to process those ballots. Now, typically, they're only allowed to process ballots that are received by the election day. Mm-hmm. Now, after what happened in Wisconsin, most recently, the Supreme Court actually took up a case where they actually maintained that any ballots that were postmarked by the date of election day were actually able to be counted. And Minnesota and Wisconsin both share a similar state regulation that typically it has to be received by that date. So that means that if there is an overabundance of ballots that come in as vote by mail or absentee in the upcoming election, that does actually set a precedent that perhaps would help Minnesota if we are not able to process all of those ballots within the 2 days after, or if some arrive late. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. And now back to the topic that you had asked me about around vote by mail. Mm-hmm. How do I feel about vote by mail? I'm a big supporter. I think, as you would imagine, being the vice chair for the elections committee, the fundamentals of our democracy are something that I am extremely passionate about. It's something that I'm a little bit of a geek on some of those things. It makes me really excited to talk about things like democracy, the foundation of our nation and our state, and all those fun things. And we just celebrated Statehood Day, I believe, yesterday.
Yeah,
So that's pretty exciting stuff, right? And vote by mail is a great way to do that.
it is.
It
So,
is.
so quick quiz. What's our state's birthday? How old is Minnesota now?
So we are 162 years old.
Yes.
And what a lot of people don't know, or some people do, is that one of the really great things about Statehood Day, as we call it, Minnesota's birthday, is that we light up the gigantic chandelier that sits in the Capitol Rotunda. And it is a stunner. I mean, it is amazing. The chandelier actually is so tall that actually a 6-foot man, much like yourself, Kevin, could actually get inside of the chandelier. And I like to tell the kids when they come to visit, if you can only imagine if you had to clean that.
Yeah. Well, they did not too long ago.
They
Sorry to
did.
go off track. I was there when they had it down for cleaning, and last year I brought my kids to the Capitol on Statehood Day
Yep.
to come celebrate, and it was fantastic. They had little commemorative pins from the Historical Society. Wonderful diversion.
Yeah.
It was a great
Yeah.
memory. But I think as far as it relates to our conversation here, we wouldn't have a state without voting, and
We wouldn't.
it is the foundation, the bedrock of our democracy is free and fair elections. So
Absolutely.
and so I think that's one of those things that we want to make sure that we all are participating in, and everybody has an opportunity to.
Right.
With the talking of vote by mail, a lot of people bring up the specter of fraud and abuse. How are we currently making sure that the elections are protected, that we are making sure that only the people who are eligible to vote are allowed to vote? What are some of the protections that we currently have in place?
Well, so first of all, the really important piece to point out is that there is little to no suggestion that vote by mail is any more likely to be fraught with voter fraud than any other type. And that said, it's important to note that even when we talk about any type of voter fraud, that it is extremely, extremely rare. And to make that point, so for example, at one time, Senator Kiffmeyer was actually served as our Secretary of State, and under her there was actually a request to do some research on what voter fraud actually looked like in the state of Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And during the course of that, what they actually found is that voter fraud was 0.001%. And what that translates into in real life, here's what it looks like, and get ready for it.
All right, I'm ready.
That means we had about a dozen or so folks who were cited for voter fraud because they actually voted in more than one place. Most of these folks were actually snowbirds who inadvertently, or perhaps they forgot, voted, say, for example, in Florida, and then voted here in Minnesota, which of course you unfortunately only get one vote, or I should say fortunately, one citizen, one voter, one vote, right? So that was a mistake. And they did find also an individual who voted, who did have a felony conviction, who was under the impression that they were free to vote and did not realize that they had to wait until their parole was completely cleared in order to vote. So it wasn't intentional, but certainly it happened. So that was what it amounted to, is a handful of folks who made mistakes.
Yeah.
And so this idea of widespread fraud is really not accurate. It's not true. It never has been. And they've done studies on this over and over again and found similar results. It's extremely unlikely.
Yeah, and that's always been my impression. I mean, I know that a nationwide review of the 2016 election happened and found negligible amounts of voter fraud and almost no intentional voter fraud.
Right.
So
it's extremely rare. And if you think about just how that works, and even when we talk about things like vote by mail, and you talk about whether that's safe or reliable, here's something to consider. And the New York Times can back this up. But in 2018, our president actually voted by mail in the midterm elections down in Florida. Yeah. Our vice president, Pence, actually voted via absentee ballot for both the primary and the general elections in 2018. Now, it seems highly unlikely that both our president and vice president would engage in something that they felt was fraudulent. And I think that's not a very good assertion. The other thing to really think about here is that states who actually employ vote by mail, for example, there are 5 states right now that almost vote exclusively by mail. These are red states and blue states, right? So this isn't a party thing. Utah, for example, highly conservative. They vote almost entirely by mail. Now, the reason that most of these states don't vote entirely by mail is because there are cases where people move or things happen. So there has to be some mechanism for folks who've moved within a certain amount of time to be able to go to a local place if they haven't been able to register at their new home. Yep. So that's possible. But right now, Utah, Colorado, Hawaii, Washington, and Oregon all vote almost exclusively by mail. And here in Minnesota, we actually have vote by mail in any city or township outside of the metro area that has 400 residents or less. They're automatically allowed to vote exclusively by mail. And many of them do. And they do so without any fraud. These are neighbors who help neighbors. And quite frankly, in these places, folks know each other. So they know if there's something nefarious going on, right? But these counties, there's about 130,000 households, I believe it is, in these smaller towns that vote exclusively. And in these places, they typically don't actually have a specific polling place. Now, there is actually a location where you can go on the same day if you need to, and they can use that as a backup. But generally, there isn't a polling place like you would think of here in the cities for you and me. For example, in District 3, as you know, we have pretty robust cities. And so we typically tend to have a full-fledged polling places with lots of hustle and bustle and poll workers. In some of these smaller areas where they vote exclusively by mail or almost exclusively by mail, you may have one individual at a local area office that can handle same-day registration.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's important to know that we already do it. We already know how to vote by mail. Just a clarification, we're not actually changing our current process this year, our election process. We're still planning, other than the changes to potential adjusting polling place locations and that type of kind of the administrative end of the election. We're not changing, we're not going all vote by mail this year in Minnesota, correct?
Well, remember we mentioned earlier that there was a bill that got split in 2. So there is actually a bill right now that would allow us to move to more vote by mail. And what's interesting about that vote by mail piece, and a lot of people do not realize, especially now with tighter budgets, but on average, vote by mail costs about $2.83 per ballot. And what's interesting about that in general is that it is actually cheaper to vote by mail than it is to do absentee balloting. And the reason for that is that in absentee balloting, there's a lot more touch points where folks have to look in and check in on those ballots. There's a lot more staffing required to process those ballots, those kinds of things, than just doing it exclusively by mail. So that's an interesting point for folks to know, because some folks think, well, if we do that, will it cost us more money? Actually, it won't. And in fact, it would ironically be cheaper than a lot of the protections that we have, or the methods that we use today, for example, absentee balloting. But at this point in time, that bill is still sitting in the House. It is still under negotiation. It is highly unlikely, however, our Republican friends do not like vote by mail very much. And we're not entirely sure all of the reasons for that. We've addressed the issue of fraud, which of course really isn't a concern. But certainly we're not implying that it never happens. But one of the other interesting parts about that to note is that if you go to a vote by mail system, for example, those ballots literally travel through the mail. Mm-hmm. That is the US Postal Service. So by doing so, what we're actually doing is making it even more secure, in that tampering with a ballot that goes through the US Postal Service is literally a federal offense. So right. In some ways, it's actually making those protections for meddling or doing something egregious that much more severe, because we are actually going through that process in a federal sense.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to be able to have robust enforcement and being able to address any malfeasance should it arise.
True.
And having any of those avenues, I think, is important to be able to do that. Yeah.
Right. Now, that said, at this point, all of the things that we have in place already are not changing. So we still have the same ability to vote by absentee. We still have all those same pieces that we had before. And Minnesota has typically been a bit of a leader in some of these areas in making it easier for citizens to actually participate and exercise their constitutional right to vote. Yeah. So we are very fortunate in that we do have things like no excuse absentee voting. We do have same-day registration for folks who were not able to register far enough in advance. Even in some of those small cities where they vote exclusively by mail, typically, as long as you're registered 21 days in advance, you don't need to do anything else. They will automatically send you a mail ballot. If you do not have that within that 21-day window, you will actually have to request a ballot on your own within that 21-day window. So that can be a slight barrier for some folks if you just recently moved to one of these smaller towns, but it's certainly not something that you can't overcome. But so in terms of whether it's changing a great deal, honestly, it's not. We will still have polling places for the day of election for those same day voter folks, or for folks who just choose to vote in person. Now, all of those things being said, because of COVID and because we know that there are populations that are much higher risk, and because we know that there may be some consolidation of polling places if we don't have enough poll workers, I would strongly recommend to those folks who are concerned that you request an absentee ballot. Yes. And it just so happens that when this recording comes out, you will be able to do just that. So I would encourage people to go out and start requesting their absentee ballots, and you should be able to find more information on that specifically on the Secretary of State's website. and how to go through that process. And it's a really fantastic site in that things are really written in plain language. They're very easy to navigate, and there are often tools in other languages on that site as well to help folks navigate. And I know there are a lot of groups that will be out in force, speaking to some of our other communities, our Somali community, our North African communities, our Indian communities, our Native American communities, and Indigenous communities. All of these different folks, Hmong, Somali, making sure that they have access to references in their native language, and to help folks get registered or to request those absentee ballots in advance. The other really great part about doing these things in advance and having your mail ballot or your absentee ballot is simply that a lot of our seniors especially, or folks who really want to carefully look at their ballots, have a really great opportunity to sit down with their ballot and do their homework. And I, as a firm believer in democracy, I truly applaud that, right? To make sure that these are individuals who share your values, so they can look at all of the candidates from school board candidates. Perhaps they're not as well versed on where their positions are. They can look those up. Judges, water and soil conservation, and of course, one of my favorites, county commissioner.
That's right. Making sure that that everybody votes for their county commissioner is important.
Yes.
As well as all of the other races that are happening, because voting is our responsibility. It is it's a wonderful thing that we get to do here. So
absolutely.
Yeah. And thank you so much for your time. And I will make sure that there is a link to the Secretary of State's site attached with this video, so that anybody who's watching this will be able to click on the link right along with it. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I will say too, obviously as things proceed, I hope that you will share some of my posts on your site as well. As you can imagine, I will be putting up lots of them to encourage people to exercise their right to vote, how to find their ballots, how to request an absentee ballot, those kinds of things as we get closer to the election. So hopefully you will share those. And with your viewers, I would really love to have that. And I will put in one last shameless plug while we're here. The 2020 census.
Oh, yeah.
If you have not already, now Minnesotans are incredible, right? We generally have the highest voter participation in the country.
Yes.
And we do that year after year. And we are also here in CD3, we are ahead of the game in terms of responding to the US Census.
That's right.
But we still have a ways to go. We're, I think, at 68, 70% responding, which means we have 30% of our households who have not yet responded. And those dollars that come along with that census are really important. That determines how much money we get for each and every citizen to pay for things like police and fire and teachers and education. So it's really important to get that done. So I would also like to just make a quick shout out. If you haven't already, you're at home already. Go look up Census 2020 Minnesota. They'll walk you through it. It's really easy.
I have another video on my YouTube channel that talks, that shows how easy the census is. Takes less than 5 minutes.
Fantastic.
Do it. So thank you, Representative Bahner. I do appreciate your time and commitment, and making sure also that we have the tools necessary to keep our citizens safe through elections, and the polling workers safe. Making sure that we're keeping everybody healthy, and we're finding ways of expanding and being inclusive in our democracy. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And I hope to be able to be a part of the process come next year at the county level.
Absolutely. And good luck on your race, Kevin. You know I'm rooting for you.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. And would you like to give a shameless plug to do you have a website that you'd like people to go to?
I do. I do. Thank you. Bonnerforhouse.com if you'd like to come look at my campaign page. Obviously, you can Google me and find me at the Minnesota House and get information on how to contact me there. Specifically, if you have issues or concerns, you can email me at rep.kristin, Kristin, .Bahner, Bahner, at house.com, or house.mn, I'm sorry. Or you can reach out to the campaign if you'd like to volunteer naturally at votekristin@gmail.com, and you can look me up literally on Facebook or Instagram. I believe it is Kristin Bahner MN if you'd like to find me.
All right, thank you.
Right.
And for my own, on my side, you can find me at votekevinanderson.com. You can send me an email if there's a topic that you want me to discuss or find another expert to talk to. You can send emails to me, kevin@votekevinanderson.com. You can find me on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, Vote Kevin Anderson. So thank you, Representative Bahner, again. I really appreciate your time. And everybody who is watching this, thank you for taking your time today. And we'll keep on, and we're make sure people get registered and get their ballots and get them submitted.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
Have a good day.
Good morning.
That's right. All right. Bye. We'll see you
Bye.
later.